All right. Hello, everyone. This week we are discussing Europe, Turkey, and Russia. The U.S. State Department region known as Europe or Eurasia covers all the Western European countries through Turkey's border with the Middle East and Southwest Asia and Russia, uh, all the countries that made up the former Soviet Union. Europe has experienced a wide variety of terrorism, including nationalist and separatist groups, left wing ideological groups, and Islamic fundamentalists. Turkey is included in this because of its location. Some will make the argument that Turkey could maybe be included in the Middle East, but it also fits well here. It's just kind of right there in the middle. The book includes it here with Europe, so that's where we're going to include it as well. So first, we're going to discuss nationalist and separatist terrorism in Europe. All right, so um, we're going to talk about three main groups. Um, Even though there's been a variety, of groups operating in Europe over the years, but the United Kingdom, Spain, and Turkey have been the home of some pretty well-known terrorist groups whose goals are to overthrow the current state, establish a new state, or create some kind of or some degree, as it is, of autonomy. So we're going to begin with the situation in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. This has been going on, you know, kind of forever. So the history of conquest in this area really kind of set the stage for the current issues that there is in the area. The Irish had loyalty to their clans, rather than the larger sovereign power, which would be the United Kingdom. And everything really kind of started between the British and the Irish, in the 16th and 17th centuries. When England established the Church of England, this upset the Irish, who were very staunchly Catholic. Okay, and so then this led to a rebellion against England. Then to make matters worse, the English established, the plantation of Ulster, which then allowed English settlers to take over the most prosperous agrarian areas and pushed out the Irish, that had been living there. So this obviously would add further divisions to the area. By the middle of the 17th century, you had this brutal civil war going on between those loyal to the Church of England and the Catholics. Okay, so the Catholics lost the Civil War. As time passed, the English in Ireland began to identify more with the Irish than the English. So at this point, the Protestants and Catholics in Ireland decided to join forces, um, which was beneficial to them until the potato famine, which led to large numbers of poor Irish to begin immigrating to the United States, or they starved to death. All right, so then in the 20th century, there were three main Irish groups. There were those that wanted home rule, who wanted Ireland to be autonomous with its own parliament but under British rule. Those who wanted full independence, and those who wanted to maintain Northern Ireland's union with the British. All of them began fighting. Okay, so you had the Republican group, which wanted complete autonomy for Ireland. They formed the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. It began as the Irish Republican Brotherhood and then morphed into the IRA after the Easter Uprising. So the IRA fought the Black and Tan War that led to independence for the main island, but not for Northern Ireland. Uh, so the treaty then led to the Civil War between the IRA and the Irish Army. The IRA continued to engage in violence because they wanted, excuse me, because they wanted complete independence for the entire country. So, in addition to violence, they also began legitimate political activities through a political party that they formed called Sinn Féin. So, as they increased their legitimate activities, some people then started believing that maybe the IRA was now too moderate. So then you had the formation of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the PIRA, or known as the Provosts. So the Provosts would be responsible for most of the terrorist attacks in the latter part of the 20th century. Um, they didn't have as much support because they used excessive, uh, they used violence excessively, and were well on their way to kind of dying out until there were some civil rights demonstrations that devolved into violence. And then the British used violence to crack down on the demonstrators, which then led to more violence. The violent crackdowns kind of reinvigorated the provos and kind of reinvigorated the public support for them. So then they continued a variety of terrorist and criminal activities, bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, beatings, and the assassination of Lord Louis Mountbatten. So the fighting continued then until 1985, but progress really wasn't made until the Belfast Agreement in 1998, and then the Provos, the PIRA, finally turned over their weapons in 2005. However, since that time, new economic and social problems have kind of emerged. So now the real Irish Republican Army emerged as a successor to the Provos. And they continued their attacks until 2012, when they ended up merging with another Irish dissident group and other groups, to form the new IRA and have continued operations. So, obviously the United Kingdom has had this long history with the Irish Republican Army. And if you want to read more about it, there's all kinds of stuff about the IRA, the Provos, well-documented history there. All right, the next area we're going to talk about is the Basque region of Spain. The people of the Basque region have long considered themselves to be independent of Spain. So the conflict between the Basques and the Spanish government started in the 1930s when the Spanish dictator outlawed most aspects of the Basque culture. And this repression even included some Basque civilians being killed. And this all kind of gave rise to the Basque Fatherland and Liberty Group that formed in 1959. So their main goal was to establish a Marxist Basque homeland. So the campaign of violence kind of began in earnest in 1968 and continued for several decades. They targeted government officials, official facilities, journalists, tourism sites, and also some civilians. Over time, Spain has given the area a lot more autonomy. So the support for the ETA has kind of lessened. Most of the known operatives were arrested in 2013. In 2011, the ETA had actually announced a formal cessation of violence, but the government didn't believe them because I guess they tried this several times before. Then in 2017, the ETA gave up their arms, and in 2018, they publicly announced that the ETA was dismantling. All right, so the final nationalist case we're going to talk about now is the situation between Turkey and the Kurdish people. So the Kurds are an ethnic group who lives in the mountainous region of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. There's about 30 million Kurds. About half of those live in Turkey. So like a lot of these conflicts, history kind of set the stage for this. So World War I set the stage for the violence that occurred decades later in this area. So Turkey used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire joined with Germany in World War I, and then when they were defeated by the Allies broke up the Ottoman Empire kind of how they wanted to, whatever fit their political leanings at the time, and really didn't take any regard for the people that lived there or the cultures of the people that lived there. So when they did that, I guess the Allies had made promises to the Kurds that they would give them their own homeland. Well, obviously this broke those promises. So the Kurds were unhappy starting at that point. The Kurdistan Workers' Party was officially founded in 1978 and initially wanted to establish a Marxist-Leninist state for the Kurdish people in the region shared by those several countries. Later years, they began to focus on independence in just the area that the Kurds inhabited in Turkey. Because think about how hard that would be, to try to establish some kind of state for the Kurdish people when you're talking about 4 different countries. So they decided to focus just on Turkey. They were attacking a variety of targets, including Europeans, um, Turkish people, rival Kurdish groups, and other supporters that they viewed were in support of, the country of Turkey, or you know how Turkey was operating. They also attacked NATO forces and kidnapped Western tourists, which is what really got the attention, of the United States uh, to all this that was going on. Around 2012, then they changed their name and tweaked their ideology a little bit to include a little bit more religion. And then in 2013, there were some secret negotiations between the Prime Minister of Turkey and the leader of the PKK, who happened to be in jail at the time, which led him to declare a cessation of violence and declare that their struggle would be strictly a political one. Now, I don't know. Makes you wonder, like, how did those negotiations go? Right? You got the Prime Minister of Turkey negotiating with the guy who's in prison. Uh, but anyway, I digress. So then they reverted back to what a loose federation that spans regions in several countries. In 2015, and this part's not in the book, in 2015, the ceasefire ended. Violence erupted again between the PKK and the military, and since that time, several thousand people have been killed. Um, so things are still, kind of going on over in Turkey. All right. So interesting thing about these last two groups we talked about, the Basques and the Kurds. Both of those had leftist ideologies. These Marxist-Leninist ideologies are what are considered leftist type of ideologies. And we'll talk about those a little more in just a second. But they're classified as nationalist groups, which, nationalist groups is a common category that people use to define right-wing groups. So these kind of examples really kind of exemplifies this difficulty that there is when you start trying to classify groups as left wing or right wing, right? In some ways, these nationalist groups, that's what considered more of this right wing kind of ideology, but then they're Marxist and Leninist, so that's this left wing ideology. So how do you really classify these kind of groups? All right, left wing groups. So many of the groups in Western Europe in the latter half of the 20th century were left wing groups that were formed in response to right-wing ideologies that were present during World War II. So again, here we have these historical events that are kind of leading to the stuff that's been going on. Also, there's always been this Marxist influence in Europe since the time of Marx. So they were also influenced by these ideologies. So this ideology is known as Marxist-Leninist. And if you recall, this was the main ideology of the Soviet Union and all the communist countries that were part of that Eastern Bloc of Europe that was formed after World War II, prior to it collapsing in 1989. All right, so the first country we're going to talk about is Greece. They've had a history of some left-wing terrorism. The most notorious group was called November 17. It formed in 1975. It was named for a student uprising that had occurred a couple years earlier. They had several goals, but their overall goal was to establish Greece as a Marxist-Leninist state. At first, they focused on assassinating U.S. officials and Greek figures. They ended up assassinating 5 U.S. embassy employees between 1975 and 2011. Later, they started incorporating some bombing and expanded their targets to include Turkish diplomats, European Union facilities, foreign firms that were investing in Greece. There's another group that was active called the Revolutionary Popular Struggle. They committed about 250 attacks against Greek and Western targets. That particular group stopped operations in 1994, but November 17 continued until about 2002, when Greece really finally cracked down on them because they had the 2004 Athens Olympics coming. And you certainly don't want, a terrorist group committing, terrorist attacks against Western targets right at the Olympics. That would be super bad for Greece. But since that time, they're considered to be defunct. There's some wonderings like, why didn't Greece do this earlier? And there's some suggestion that maybe there was some sympathies within the Greek government, or something like that kept them from really cracking down on this group prior to the Olympics. But the Olympics coming their way, they decided they better do something. There's some reports also that suggest maybe a new group emerged from those that were not arrested, and they're called the Revolutionary Struggle. All right, moving to Germany. Germany had the Red Army faction, or the Baader-Meinhof gang, also a very well-known group. They were a Marxist-Leninist group. They were known for bombings, assassinations, kidnappings. They also had several criminal enterprises that they used to fund their group. They targeted U.S. and German targets that they associated with capitalism. The RAF still exists, but has been pretty well discredited at this point. One thing that did come out of the terrorist attacks that the RAF committed was Germany formed a really high-level anti-terrorist group. It's one of the most well-respected anti-terrorist groups in the world. Right. Italy, the Red Brigades, they operated in Italy from the late 60s or early 70s until the 80s. They believed that they were going to start this worldwide communist revolution, and violent activity in Italy would start the revolution in Italy, and then it would spread to Europe, and then on to the rest of the world. They targeted Western targets, NATO targets, committed murders and kidnapping. One of the most high-profile ones that really led to their demise was they kidnapped Brigadier General James Dozier, and then the raid that was conducted to release him led to the arrest of some some terrorists, who then ended up giving up other members of the group, and that was in 1981. And then by 1983, the group had pretty much disbanded because 59 people at that point had been arrested. They have reemerged in 1999 and then operated again until more arrests in 2004. And other countries like France and Belgium have also had some experiences with left-wing terrorism. All right, so to this point, we've pretty much just talked about domestic European terrorist groups. Terror groups formed by Europeans committing acts of terrorism in Europe. But there's also some Islamic terrorist groups operating in Europe. These groups have been pretty successful at recruiting from the immigrant communities that live in Europe, kind of particularly concerning to the authorities in Europe is that many of these recruits are not new immigrants, okay, but people that are born or were born in Europe and have lived in Europe their whole lives, because common thought was that lack of opportunity in countries leads young men to commit terrorism, or lack of opportunity combined with what they view as oppression, right? That leads people to commit terrorism. But the people that are being recruited now, generally speaking, come from middle-class backgrounds, and enjoy the opportunities that Europe affords, to anybody that lives there. So that is particularly concerning to anti-terrorism authorities in Europe. There's kind of two aspects that have made it harder for authorities to determine. Those two aspects make it harder for authorities to determine who's at risk for terrorist activities. Vedino did a study kind of looking at this, and he suggests that what's going on is actually a different type of recruitment where the young men living in Europe are actually seeking out the groups kind of rather than the other way around, and that they're doing more of a self-radicalizing rather than being radicalized by somebody else. So he proposed that this is happening in kind of four phases: establishment phase, globalized phase, homegrown phase, and linkage. So I'll just kind of briefly go into these. In the establishment phase, militants and jihadists moved to Europe in the late 80s and early 90s. They were fleeing repression in their home countries, and Europe represented this freedom that they could go where they would be pretty much free, from attention from local authorities and could kind of operate how they wanted. But during this time, they realized that in order to have this freedom, they would have to not commit attacks in their new country, and they pretty much held to that. In the globalized phase, this began in the late 90s. Uh, Many of these hierarchical networks that had formed in Europe. Now, before this, they were all kind of operating independently, right? You had these networks in different places, but they were all kind of independent from one another, really not interacting much at all. But then you had this emergence of Osama bin Laden. So a lot of these hierarchical networks, then started pledging allegiance to bin Laden and answered his call to form this worldwide kind of Islamic front. Um, he also called for targets to be expanded, to start including U.S. targets and other Western targets, rather than kind of the more traditional targets that these groups would have focused on. So now these formerly autonomous European networks are beginning to collaborate and interact, and then bin Laden provided his ideological linkage for them, which they needed to collaborate together and change their focus to something different. Homegrown phase began after 9/11. So the worldwide kind of crackdown after 9/11, led to this disruption of the networks. Right, Europe started cracking down. The United States was cracking. Everybody was cracking down on these jihadist networks, but it didn't destroy them. It just led to a disruption. So at this point, the networks in Europe began to operate independently again, because of this disruption that happened to bin Laden's network. But at this time, too, the demographics started to change a little bit. Prior, it was all first-generation immigrants, people that had moved to Europe, from these other countries were the people that were forming these networks. But now, they're incorporating more second and third generation European-born residents. And then these people started to seek out groups outside of Europe. So as the demographics started changing, they started trying to find people to link up with outside of Europe. But they had self-radicalized pretty much. And these groups that were forming now, these networks, after they've been disrupted, they have very little structure. Okay, because what's easy to disrupt? Networks that have a hierarchical structure, right? So now we have these cell-based structures forming that lack real ties to external organizations. They're trying to find some linkages, but they're not really tied to anybody. And they focus more on domestic issues and targets. All right, so finally you have the linkage phase. This is just characterized by these groups trying to establish linkages between their homegrown networks and outside organizations such as Al Qaeda. All right, I know that was a lot, but I'm going to stop there now. And as always, if you have questions, please let me know. And be sure to complete your assignments for the week, and I'll see you next week.